todos los que nos acompañan en este seminario de perspectivas multidisciplinarias sobre salud y migración. En esta ocasión tenemos como invitado al doctor Anthony Jimenez. Él es profesor asistente de sociología en el Rochester Institute of Technology. Es originario de la región fronteriza entre México y Estados Unidos, en El Paso, Texas. Obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de Minnesota y su actual investigación ha sido financiada en parte por la Fundación Ford. Se centra este estudio en el imperialismo fronterizo y la intersección entre inmigración y servicios de salud. En futuras investigaciones, el doctor Jiménez planea explorar cómo la pandemia por COVID-19 ha delineado las experiencias y opciones de cuidado en casa de la población migrante. Antes de dar paso a su presentación, me gustaría comentar solamente para aquellas personas que nos acompañan a través de redes sociales, que estaremos recibiendo sus comentarios y preguntas en esas vías a través de YouTube y Facebook, donde también se está transmitiendo nuestra sesión de seminario. Entonces, siéntanse en la libertad de hacer algún comentario o pregunta en el transcurso de la presentación por esa vía, y quienes nos acompañan por Blue Jeans también podremos recoger comentarios y preguntas a través del chat o bien de manera verbal en la sección de discusión. Iniciaremos la sesión con la presentación del doctor Anthony Jiménez y después de su presentación daremos paso a esta sesión de comentarios y preguntas. Les pedimos a quienes nos acompañan por Blue Jeans que mantengan sus micrófonos apagados durante la sesión y los puedan abrir en el momento en que vayan a hacer alguna intervención al final de ella. Entonces, sin más, damos paso a la presentación del doctor Anthony Jiménez, que se titula Medical Border Control, How Healthcare Shapes Illegality. Les recuerdo que la presentación va a ser en inglés. Sin embargo, también tienen la libertad de escribir sus comentarios y preguntas en español durante la sesión de discusión y haremos la traducción para el doctor Jiménez. Bueno, sin más, podemos dar inicio a la presentación. Thank you so much for being with us, Anthony, and you can go over your presentation whenever you want to.
Okay. Buenos días a todos. Gracias, Olga. Un momento. Okay. Thank you, Olga, for the introduction. So very briefly, and thank you all for having me here. I'm really happy to be a part of the seminary series and to be sharing my work with everyone. And thank you also for your patience with me as I present my work in English. I do know some Spanish, but have not practiced it enough to feel fluent enough to present my work in Spanish. So I appreciate your patience with me in that regard. And I know that some of my work was perhaps circulated for others to read. And so what I'm presenting here is a little bit different from the article that was published and shared with everyone. It does draw on a different theoretical framework than what the article shares, but essentially draws from the same data and has us think about several similar points. So again, my name is Anthony Jimenez. As Olga mentioned, I am from the Rochester Institute of Technology, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And this work is based on an 11-month ethnography with an NGO in Houston, Texas, that I call Justicia y Paz. And this NGO serves exclusively low-income, undocumented migrants in need of shelter, food, and healthcare. And when I've given this talk before, particularly among students, I would usually begin with this activity very, very briefly with students to ask them to locate where the border is between first the United States and Mexico, and they generally get that question correct. They're like, it's right here. Then I move on to ask them, well, where is the border between China and Mongolia? And they struggle a little bit more, but generally get it correct. But then I move on to ask the real kicker, the real difficult question, to ask them to identify the border between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And assuming that they know their oceans and not out here somewhere, they will struggle to, say, well, maybe it's right here, maybe it's in the middle here, maybe it's a little bit off to the right. The point being that it's difficult to determine where exactly the border is between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, to really drive home the point that borders are social constructs, that borders are socio-politically created for a variety of purposes, right? In terms of sovereignty, in terms of resources, so on and so forth. And in the words of philosopher Etienne Balibar, the border is no longer at the border. It can be in various different spaces and institutions. Generally, when I ask students or others to think about the border, the image that comes to mind is something like this, the image of the US-Mexico border in particular for many of my students. When I ask them to think about borders, they generally do not think about images like this, healthcare systems. These two images invoke two very different sentiments. The image on the left is imagined as a space that regulates illegality, right? And the space on the right is imagined as a space that addresses the consequences of health disparities. But the purpose of my talk today is to discuss the ways in which both spaces perform the same work of border control. And to do this, I have to begin by turning to the relationship discussed in the literature about the relationship between illegality and health disparities. Now, medical sociologists and immigration scholars have examined the relationship between illegality and health disparities in two ways predominantly. For medical sociologists, illegality tends to be examined as a social determinant of health, right? Illegality influences health disparities. Immigration scholars, on the other hand, have demonstrated an inverse relationship, a relationship where adverse health justifies the legal exclusion of undocumented immigrants. For example, migrants have been medically quarantined at the border for not being quote unquote healthy enough to enter into the country. And they have also been medically deported from hospital systems when the long-term care costs of their care becomes a financial burden to the healthcare system. They are medically deported from that system. And so what the whole of this literature demonstrates then is a dialectical relationship. Illegality influences health disparities and health disparities affects illegality. But up to this point, both sides of this dialectic focus predominantly on immigrant healthcare exclusion, leading us to this oftenly asked question within the literature. But in my research, I examine illegality not just as a juridical status that can justify exclusion, but also a socio-legal condition, right? A lived condition that the healthcare system can control, shape, and regulate. So in short, I extend beyond the question of how the healthcare system enforces legality to the question of how the healthcare system regulates and shapes the conditions of illegality. And to frame this research, I draw on critical migration scholars' theoretical understanding of border control. So according to critical migration scholars, border control can be conceptualized as a sort of spectacle. And on one side of this spectacle, we have what's referred to as the scene of exclusion. And this is the very explicit tough on immigration stance that seeks to enforce the terms of legality. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have what's referred to as the upscene of inclusion. And this is the less visible function of border control that seeks to regulate migrants' illegality and labor power. And the work of medical sociologists and immigration scholars maps onto the left side of this border spectacle, reflecting border control's three overarching operations: denial, detention, and deportation. Scholarship to date illustrates the healthcare system's capacity to legally enforce migrants' exclusion. And so migrants are legally denied access to healthcare. They are legally quarantined at the physical border when they have adverse health. And they are also legally medically deported when their long-term care becomes a burden to hospital systems. But what about this other side of border control? What about this upside of inclusion? So focusing on the same triad of operations, denial, detention, and deportation, I asked this question: how does the healthcare system regulate illegality? How does it shape this lived condition? But before getting too far ahead of myself, I do want to offer a brief roadmap for what will remain in the remainder of this talk that I'm giving today. So I'm going to begin by just very briefly situating my research in the context of today's healthcare system in the United States. And when I say today, I actually mean pre-COVID. The research that I conducted was actually in 2014, 2015. So this is before COVID affected us all the way that it is today. But I'd be happy to maybe talk about some of the implications of today's healthcare system as we try to battle COVID globally. So after situating my research in this context, I'll briefly discuss the methods that I used, followed by an overview of my findings and analysis, and then conclude with some broader ideas and implications of my research. So first, the context. The context of my research really takes off with the passing of the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So this law was passed, it was put into law in 2010, and in 2015, the US Department of Health and Human Services indicated that nearly 16.4 million people had gained some form of health insurance, some form of health coverage. And that was the purpose of the law, in large part to ensure that everybody in the country had some form of coverage. The problem, however, is that this number does not reflect the estimated 11.3 million undocumented immigrants in the country. And to be clear, undocumented immigrants, as per federal law, were ineligible for health coverage before the ACA. And after the ACA, or the Affordable Care Act, they remained ineligible. So the assumption was that nothing has changed. But in fact, things have changed. And to understand how, we have to turn to what's referred to as the healthcare safety net. So like indigent citizens in the United States, most undocumented immigrants rely on the healthcare safety net for healthcare. And the healthcare safety net is made up of federally qualified health centers, charity clinics, community health centers, and any NGO that provides care to individuals without regard for ability to pay. So again, the reason people use the healthcare safety net is because they cannot pay for healthcare themselves, which again includes undocumented immigrants in this context. And the way that the healthcare safety net is funded is through federal reimbursements, or what are referred to as disproportionate share hospital payments. And the purpose of these federal reimbursements is to help safety net providers offset the costs of uncompensated care. Again, if you're using the safety net, it's because you can't afford to pay for it otherwise. Now, what was supposed to happen under the ACA, under the Affordable Care Act, is everybody was supposed to gain some form of health coverage, which means that more and more the assumption was that people would not need the safety net as much. The need for the safety net would decrease over time. And so under this logic, the federal government decided to slowly begin taking out and withdrawing its level of federal reimbursements. So both of these spheres, right, the safety net need and federal reimbursements, were supposed to shrink over time. One was supposed to be absorbed by the other. We were supposed to be all good, no harm, no foul. We are in great shape. But what actually happened was quite different, especially in states like Texas, which is the state that I did my research in, which is a state that did not expand Medicaid and is a state that has a high population of undocumented immigrants who were never eligible for any form of health coverage. So what happened in contexts like Texas is federal reimbursements continue to be decreased over time, but the need for the safety net did not decrease, which means one was not absorbed into the other, and we were left in a very difficult situation where all of a sudden safety net practitioners had to provide for the same amount of people, but with less federal funding. And so how has the safety net responded to this? Historically speaking, healthcare safety net providers have always focused more on Medicaid-eligible citizens than undocumented immigrants. But because their federal reimbursements are fading away, because they're receiving less and less federal reimbursements throughout time, undocumented immigrants are becoming less and less of a focus, because ultimately it is about the survival of the healthcare safety net. They want to remain afloat to be able to care for as many folks as they can. Thus, in today's context, in today's healthcare context, negotiating access to spaces like Houston's medical district is becoming increasingly exceptional, and undocumented immigrants in particular have fewer options for health services than ever before. And so my question in all of this then is how they interact, how undocumented immigrants in particular interact with the US healthcare system. And in particular to this today's talk, my focus is, again, how do we see medical border control happen here? How does the healthcare system not only enforce levels of exclusion, but how does it also regulate and shape the conditions of illegality? To answer this question, I conducted an 11-month ethnography with an organization, as I mentioned before, called Justicia. And I want to mention now real quick that all of the photos that I share in this presentation are shared with the permission of folks at the organization. And all of the names that I share, including the organization name, are pseudonyms. So I am not using anyone's real name in this presentation. So, excuse me, the photo that is presented here on the screen for you all is actually a drawing from one of the men that I worked with at Justicia, and it was designed to really capture the essence of the Catholic worker movement. This is the movement that really guides all of the activities of Justicia. So guided by this Catholic worker movement, Justicia provides a range of services exclusively to undocumented immigrants from various regions around the world, but predominantly Latin America and predominantly from Mexico. And the services that they provide include very, very basic healthcare, food that includes daily meals, and temporary shelter. So I spent 11 months at this organization volunteering and really sort of spending time with folks at the organization and getting to know their day-to-day lives as they navigate life around Houston, Texas. And in this image here, part of my activities was to teach English twice a week to folks, predominantly migrant men. One thing that I think is important to mention here is that most of my analysis does focus on the experiences of migrant men. And the reason for this is because the organization director requested that I limit my interactions with migrant women. They wanted me to focus predominantly on the experiences of migrant men. So respecting the organization's requests, that's what I did. So I spent time with the men as they navigated life in Houston, Texas. I drove them to medical appointments across the medical district of Houston, and really had a chance to see how they're navigating different aspects of life in Houston. And in addition to working with and participating in the lives of migrant men at Justicia, I also had a chance to interact with and learn about the lives of other volunteers at Justicia, and how they navigate the organization's challenges and try to do what they can to provide as much care as possible. So in addition to the 11 months of ethnography, I conducted about 200 informal interviews with migrants and volunteers who came in and out of the organization, along with 36 semi-structured in-depth interviews half of which were with migrants, the other half of which were with volunteers. And all of this, all of these methods, again, were used to understand migrants' experiences, particularly with the healthcare system in Houston, Texas, and to, again, really explore how does the healthcare system that they're interacting with shape the conditions of illegality. So let's go ahead and turn to what I found. And as I go through this, I will be situating my findings in these three boxes. I find myself being a little bit of a visual person, so please bear with me on that a little bit here. Thank you. So first, denial. In border control parlance, denial generally refers to the rejection of some sort of legal status, whether that is denied entry into the country or the denial of a renewed visa status. It is about denying something legally. But what critical migration scholars stress is that denial is not just about exclusion. It is also about regulation. It is about shaping the conditions of illegality. And we begin to see this with the story of a 76-year-old undocumented man from Mexico named Pedro. Now, Pedro had been at the organization for about 2 years before I arrived for the ethnography. And the thing that Pedro struggles with is he has a lot of pain in his urinary tract. He has an abnormality in his urinary tract that causes him a lot of pain. He often urinates blood and feels a sharp stinging in his urinary tract whenever he needs to use the restroom. And prior to my arrival at Justicia y Paz, Pedro would go to the Bentov emergency room to get a catheter, to change out a catheter every 2 weeks or so. But eventually the hospital said, you know what, Pedro, we can't do this anymore because you're not paying for this service and it's becoming quite costly. So Pedro could have this abnormality in his urinary tract fixed with a surgery. Right, there could be something surgically fixed and he wouldn't have to change out the catheter over and over again. But the main problem that Pedro faces is that he has no ID. And this leads to a variety of consequences. So what are these consequences? Because Pedro has no ID, he enters into a sort of domino effect of exclusion. Because he has no ID, he cannot see a primary care provider. And if he can't see a primary care provider, he cannot get the referral he needs to have his urinary tract abnormality surgically fixed, which means the only option left for Pedro is to wait for his urinary tract to go into full kidney failure. He essentially has to wait for his condition to become so life-threatening that the hospital system might take him into the system on an emergency care basis. And the important thing to bear in mind here is that this domino effect of exclusion began not because Pedro was undocumented, but more specifically because he has no ID. So what could Pedro do? When I talked to Pedro about this situation, about different things he's considering, he mentioned one strategy was to potentially try to go to jail. He says, you know what, man, I think I should just rob a store or something, raise hell somewhere so I can go to jail. I'm tired of this shit, man. I'm just so tired. At least in jail, I could get this shit taken care of. So Pedro's assumption is that if he were to go to jail, he could gain some form of health care for this condition he is suffering from in jail. And when I probed for more information about this from Pedro, it became clear that in his thought was that if he did something petty, he could eventually come back out with a jail ID that could be used as a valid form of identification to gain access into the healthcare system in Houston. And when I spoke to other doctors in the area, they corroborated this possibility. They corroborated the idea that other folks have used their jail IDs as their form of identification to access care. And of course, there are several risks to this approach, including detention, deportation, and as is documented in the health literature, several incarceration-related health problems. But of additional concern is the fact that Pedro has to consider playing into preconceived notions of criminality associated with his undocumented status. And this is merely out of desperation, out of a desperation to gain some form of care. And when we deconstruct this further, as I mentioned, we recognize that Pedro's denial of care, again, is based less on his legality, that is, his undocumented status, and more on his lack of identifiability, the fact that he has no ID. Whether real or counterfeit, the ID is what makes Pedro legible to the state and constitutes what I refer to as legible illegality. It is essentially what keeps Pedro legible and traceable and manageable to the state. So what does this mean for folks like Pedro who don't have an ID? Well, let's begin generally with the concept of illegality and what it does. Illegality, according to critical migration scholars, is a socio-legal condition, not just a juridical status. It's something that influences day-to-day life and day-to-day experiences. And according to critical migration scholars, illegality doesn't mean that undocumented immigrants are automatically deported, but rather it places them under a constant threat of deportation. And this constant threat of deportation is what makes them subject to different forms of exploitation, namely around their labor power in the US context. But this relationship is generally understood in relation to migrants with legible illegality, right? So what happens to individuals like Pedro whose illegality is not legible? What happens to them? I promise we will return to this figure here because in a lot of ways, this is what my research seeks to find out. But at this point, if we're informed by this idea and theoretical framework of border spectacle, what we see is that the denial of care not only operates as a means of restricting access to services, but it also serves as a checkpoint for classifying illegality in terms of legibility. That is, deciding which form of exploitation a migrant will be subjected to. So then, what happens to undocumented immigrants whose illegality is not legible? Based on my observations, one consequence is detention through care. Now, detention generally regards the state's capacity to detain migrants for indefinite periods of time. And in this level of my analysis, I compare detention to informal personal care homes. Excuse me. While there are important exceptions, citizens generally receive federally subsidized home care by medically accredited individuals. So the image of long-term care that comes to mind for citizens in the United States is what we see here on the screen, potentially. But for undocumented migrants without an ID, that is, those whose illegality is illegible, the alternative is informal home care, which is generally operated by individuals without medical training. And during the course of my research, I visited about 10 of these spaces and observed dire conditions. And in the following vignette that I'm going to share with you right now, I'm with another volunteer from Hususipas named Richard. So this comes directly from my field notes. I will read this along with you. So Richard and I thought we were meeting a man named Esteban, but instead we met Benjamin. Inviting us in through the window, we walked through his front yard, greeted by the unyielding barking of two small dogs covered in fleas with roach-infested food bowls and algae-spread bowls of water. Once inside, we were surrounded by the scent of urine and an overflow of clothes no less than 2 feet from the ceiling. No air conditioner, no fan. The 90-degree weather cooked the single-bedroom house, trapping the humidity inside. Roaches crawled on every surface, including our backs. Half of Benjamin's face was drooped down, exposing the full sphere of his right eye. He lived alone. He had no caretaker. It became clear by the second hour of our conversation that Benjamin wanted someone to talk to. He needed someone to talk to, someone to connect with. So the reason I share Benjamin's case is because I feel that it does exemplify some levels of affinity between personal care homes and migrant detention centers. And a central comparison regards the care that Benjamin actually received. While migrant detention centers are expected to provide some level of care, this is not always the case. And in Benjamin's case, though the expectation was that someone would provide him 24-hour care, this was clearly not happening. Unlike formal home care settings, which are funded through government programs like Medicare or Medicaid, if we will, spaces like this are entirely funded by Justicia y Paz, the NGO that I did my ethnography with. And caregivers are generally migrants' families or private citizens. But this informal setup makes it very difficult to see whether or to what extent migrants are actually getting the care that they need. And another common experience that Benjamin's case illustrates has to do with social disconnection. Benjamin clearly waits for indefinite periods of time, wondering when or if someone will come visit him, listen to his stories, and connect with him. And this level of social disconnect echoes the conditions of formal detention centers where people are increasingly separated from their friends, loved ones, and families. And among the stories that Benjamin shared with me and Richard, he shared that he had at one point hired a prostitute, not for sex, but for conversation. He wanted someone to talk to. And while we were talking to him, when we indicated that we had to leave, he became very frantic. He suggested that we stay. He offered to cook us tacos. And when we stood up to leave, he began to cry and urged us to come see him every single day. But we knew that we couldn't. Even if Benjamin did have a caregiver with him, though, there is no guarantee that he would have actually been cared for. In many of these spaces that I visited, migrants lived in private homes with caregivers that didn't speak a word of Spanish. In one case, a 75-year-old man named Ricardo spends most of his days secluded in a small room because none of his three caregivers speaks a word of Spanish. He is literally surrounded by people, but no one to talk to. And in another example, a 42-year-old man from Honduras named Gilberto lives in a space with 6 other undocumented men and 5 caregivers who don't speak Spanish. And what Gilberto shared with me is that his bed is filled with bed bugs. And I know that this image might cause some of us to cringe a little bit, but the reason that I share it is because I think it is important to imagine and understand the lived experiences of Gilberto's reality. The understanding that he would go to sleep every single night knowing that he would be eaten or bitten by bed bugs. But unfortunately for Gilberto and Ricardo, the other man that I mentioned, his choices are limited. Even in notifying Justicia y Paz, the director there, about this situation would not guarantee that he'd be able to be moved to a space that's any better. And in a lot of ways, the conditions could be a lot worse. And so he is confined to this space for his long-term care. And all of this begs the question then about who are these caregivers and what does their care actually do? And what I found is that with some variation, most of the caregivers I met were African-American men and women and migrant families. And it became very clear that for many of them, this was a central source of income for them. And I'm not suggesting that they made fortunes off of this work. That is quite the contrary. Like most care workers in the U.S. context, they were significantly underpaid for this labor. And the implications of this are significant. Safety net hospitals generally regard migrant illness as a cost to the healthcare system because most undocumented migrants cannot pay back their medical costs. So what does the state do? It externalizes these costs to first Justicia and then these informal personal care homes. And in doing so, it basically exploits the labor of these caregivers and turns migrant illness itself into a commodity that can be shared and privatized for private gain. Which means we can return briefly to this figure that I promised we would return to. What happens to undocumented immigrants whose illegality is not legible? They become subject to an additional type of exploitation, where their bodies and illnesses become commodities to be controlled and regulated in personal care homes. And this finding adds to the relationship that I'm examining between border control and medical control. Like migrant detention centers, informal personal care homes commodify migrant bodies for private gain. And within the realm of healthcare specifically, this means commodifying migrant illness. And so this then leaves us with one more question. What happens to undocumented immigrants without an ID who are not taken in by one of these personal care homes, these informal personal care homes? Or in other words, what is another consequence of illegible illegality? And to answer this, I turn to Border Control's final operation, deportation. In Border Control parlance, deportation is the state-sanctioned act of removing undocumented migrants from the nation state. And here, my analysis centers on the ways that migrants fall through the cracks of the system and face eventual death, especially when they need long-term care. And one example of long-term care pertains to cancer. So I spoke to a volunteer doctor at Justicia about cancer care for undocumented immigrants. And this is how he responded to my questions. He said, it's bad. It's cancer care for the undocumented is not there. It's just not there for the most part. They're dying of cancer, period. So where do they go? They don't. They either go back to their countries or they just live with it until they die. So what I think is important to highlight here is the idea of choice that Henry presents for undocumented immigrants in situations like this. He suggests that folks can go back to their home countries or live with this condition until they die. But many of the men that I spoke with at Justicia voiced a very different reality. For many of them, they are physically, economically, or politically unable to return to their home countries to have their health needs met, which means that they essentially have nowhere to go. And when I asked folks at Justicia about this, they shared this sentiment quite often. For example, when I asked Rodrigo what he would have done if Justicia did not exist, he said, I think I would have bought a gun and pulled a bullet in my head. What else could I do? I have nowhere to go. Similarly, an undocumented Mexican man named Elias explained, now I have nowhere to go. I've been here at Justicia for a year, and have you seen anyone coming here to look for me? I have no one. The organization's directors are the only family that I have. And so for many of the men at Justicia, their choice is limited to how they're going to deal with their illness and survive each day from day to day. And in short, the US healthcare system is set in a way that prolongs undocumented migrant suffering until their eventual death. And so in examples of this, we look at Pedro, the man who waits for his urinary tract to turn into full kidney failure. Pedro shares, I'm just tired. I'm tired of waiting all the time, and now I'm waiting to die. And echoing this, I spoke to another man named Efren, who is a 60-year-old man from Mexico, who explains a sentiment shared among many of the men at the organization. So Efren says, life is beautiful, man. I don't want to die, but some of those guys have given up and asked to die every day. And if we understand deportation as the means by which migrants are removed from the nation state, death becomes the ultimate tool for accomplishing this. So what does this mean in terms of regulation and control? The case of Pedro, the man with the abnormality in his urinary tract, helps us answer this. Ultimately, because Pedro's illegality is not legible with an ID, his labor power cannot be managed. And if it cannot be managed, it cannot be construed as productive. And if he is understood as unproductive, he is essentially allowed to die. Which takes us back to this figure here. When the system allows undocumented immigrants whose illegality is illegible to die, it is essentially filtering out, quote unquote, unproductive labor. Thus, the full relationship between healthcare and border control becomes apparent. And on one hand, the concept of illegality provides the legal means by which healthcare can be denied, quarantine can be implemented, and medical deportation can be enforced, leading to an array of subsequent health disparities. At the same time, however, I complete this dialectic with an inverse relationship. When the healthcare system confronts immigrant health disparities, it shapes the conditions of illegality. In short, it acts as a mechanism of border control that classifies illegality by legibility, refashions migrant illness into a commodity, and filtrates quote-unquote unproductive labor by allowing migrants without an ID to die. So what are the implications of this research? There are a few to talk about here. First, immigrant health is premised on legality and legibility. Most of the immigrant health disparities literature tends to focus on questions about legality, questions about is someone documented or undocumented. But what my research really highlights is the importance of understanding the consequences of legibility or illegibility. Second, my research shows that the realm of private medicine is expanding to include informal personal care homes. And if the United States continues down this path of privatized medicine, which it has been for decades, the only long-term care available to indigent migrants and citizens will be spaces like these informal personal care homes where people are forced to care for themselves in a long-term capacity. Lastly, this research illustrates the ways in which the healthcare system and border control not only perform the same work, but also strengthen one another's institutional power. Both of these institutions react to and shape illegality's power as a socio-legally constructed condition with very real and very detrimental consequences. And so to conclude, I began with this go-to image that many people think about when they hear the term the border. Many folks often imagine the border as a particular space that monitors certain bodies and is regulated by certain authorities. But we generally don't think about border control and imagine this, health institutions. And like border control, I wanted us to begin thinking about the ways that healthcare can also fundamentally regulate the ways undocumented immigrants in the United States live and die. So thank you very much for your time. I, again, am very happy to be here and share this work with you all and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for this interesting and relevant presentation that definitely it's worth to discuss, to analyze, to visualize what's going on in the border in regards to health. And so we can open now for discussion, comments, and questions. We will start with the people that is joining us through Blue Jeans. Vamos a empezar con la sesión de preguntas, comentarios. Vamos a dar primero paso a los comentarios que puedan tener quienes nos acompañan a través de Blue Jeans y después vamos a dar seguimiento a los comentarios o preguntas que los que nos siguen a través de redes sociales hagan a través de YouTube o Facebook. Entonces, primero quiero abrir la posibilidad de participación para quienes están conectados a través de Blue Jeans. Si alguno de ustedes tiene algún comentario.
Olga, no sé si cómo manejamos la cuestión de los idiomas, habrá la posibilidad de que haya preguntas en español y que sean traducidas, porque quizá eso va a facilitar también la...
Sí, lo comentaba al principio, pueden hacer sus comentarios y preguntas en español y nosotros vamos a hacer la traducción para Anthony. Entonces, son bienvenidos sus comentarios en preguntas en español o en inglés. Entonces, dicho esto, no sé si alguien de quienes nos acompañan a través de Blue Jeans quisiera iniciar. Tenemos aquí un comentario en el chat de Nayeli. Lo voy a tratar de traducir. Dice, so interesting the work that you presented. I would like to know your opinion about the biopolitic and necropolitic perspective to understand how states like are more working on the death than in life, how they do more to pursue death than life. So I don't know if was it clear for you, Anthony, or if someone would like to add any clarification on the comment.
I think so. I can go ahead and try to answer this question, and thank you for this question, Nayeli. So what I'm understanding in terms of the question is to think about my research in relation to biopolitics and necroviolence. And so I think that first, in terms of biopolitics, this Foucauldian notion about make, live, and let die, right? I think is very relevant here to think about the ways in which the state externalizes its operations to institutions like the healthcare institution. That the state does not have to directly get involved to regulate how undocumented immigrants in particular live their day-to-day lives. It can simply let the healthcare system operate the way that it does to do this regulation for it. And so I think that there is an important way in which the state sort of pushes aside its responsibility, or to say, I'm not involved at all, I'm not even there. But what my research illustrates is that the state is very much present, that it is working through the healthcare institution to perform this biopolitical function of regulating how migrants live and die. And in terms of necroviolence, I think this is a really important concept and idea to engage with as well. I think specifically about Jason De Leon's book and about migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert and the necroviolence that is experienced there. I think that I don't engage with the concept of necroviolence very much in my research, particularly because I think I'm more interested in the concept of social death. So necroviolence being the way in which the state abuses the dead, right, and sort of ignores the idea that death had occurred at all. And social death, on the contrary, or relatedly, I should say, has to do with the ways in which the state makes life and death very difficult to distinguish from, where the state tries to decrease the value of migrants so much that when death does occur, it's not seen as consequential. And so this research that I'm sharing is part of a larger book project that I would like to do that really sort of narrows in on this idea of legibility. And what does it mean to be legible? What does it mean to matter or be seen as not mattering within the broader US context? How do we fight for legibility? How do we fight for visibility? So that when abuses like this happen, it actually raises a flag and to say that this is an abuse. This is something that does need to be changed. This is not simply a medical failure. This is a state-sanctioned action to again dictate how migrants live and die. That may have been a really broad way to answer this question, but I do appreciate this question very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that elaboration. And she added something else, but I think it was covered in your answer as well. And Daniel tiene también un comentario. Adelante, Daniel.
Hello. I do want to congratulate you on your work, Dr. Jimenez. I'm a student right now at the Colegio Frontera Norte in Cultural Studies, and my focus is on spirituality and health. But I do have a question, and because you mentioned that you did several interviews, and I want to know if any of the subjects reported, or what are your thoughts on mental health? Because when I think of the health as an institution, there are some like illnesses that are not visible, like cancer, or this particular case with Pedro. So I just want to know if this NGOs or there's any other institution that provides assistance with mental health. And this might be not related, but when you mentioned that several of the individuals were like waiting to die, which I consider that that's something like very deep and problematic. Have they considered the option of suicide, or there's like a number or something that we can relate on? And what's the last question? I'm sorry, I do know that this is maybe not part of the research, but I want to know if when this help from the institution and the state fails, if these migrants, do they use some sort of alternative methods to take care of their illnesses, like alternative medicine or any other type of practice that they may bring from their home, I don't know, the origin or their countries? And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for these questions. So I tried to write down different aspects of your question. Please forgive me if I miss something. I could definitely return to it over and over again. But I guess I do want to begin with this question of mental health, which I think is really important. So this space that I did my ethnography with, the philosophy behind Justicia y Paz and the Catholic worker movement is to treat everybody as a Christ-like figure, to basically treat everyone as Christ and provide them whatever they need, whether it's something physical, something substantive like food, clothing, and to help them regardless of what type of healthcare need they may be in need of. So that could be a physical need, it could be a mental health need as well. While also understanding that there are limits to what they can really offer, besides maybe just a shoulder to lean on, or to listen to each other's stories. I think that the organization, in my sense, is that the organization is very aware that mental health continues to be stigmatized in the United States context, and particularly among people of color, particularly among people who are racialized as non-white. And I think that the organization tries to, maybe not explicitly, but they try to destigmatize mental health by really sort of embracing the fact that we are all sort of in different mental states when they arrive at the organization. And in a lot of ways, they try to raise money to, among many of its other services, to be able to send migrants to mental health services, the professional services that they could utilize, which was not always the case, but was something that they tried to offer. I think that, so yeah, Justicia y Paz was trying to really support these efforts. There were at least 2 cases when one of the men, or when a couple of the men at Justicia y Paz became suicidal, and was very explicit about intentions to kill themselves, to just end it all. And really what happened is the other men at Justicia y Paz and the volunteers became very involved to listen to this individual and basically talk them out of it, which I think is really powerful, considering the fact that this space is a community during a time and in a political atmosphere when so much of that community may not exist outside of Justicia y Paz, or it's difficult to form those communities. But so on one hand, this is a really powerful, beautiful thing that folks come together to help these individuals. On the other hand, it's such a critique to how broken the system is. The fact that that it's only at this level of very, very informal care that people's mental health can be addressed in this capacity, because volunteers at Justicia y Paz and other migrants at Justicia y Paz are not medically trained. They are not mental health professionals. They have very little exposure many times to how to handle mental health crises when people become suicidal. So there's another layer of mental and emotional labor that goes into providing care at this space of Justicia y Paz. And to your final question, and again, if I missed something, please let me know. But to your final question about alternative methods and alternative medicine, I didn't find as much about using alternative medicine. I know that there are spaces. I have a colleague in Arizona who worked with an organization where that was more the case. At Justicia y Paz, I didn't see so much of the alternative medicine. There were a few instances of individuals calling on folks from their home countries, in this case, Mexico, this one man that I'm thinking about, to basically bring in the prescription drugs that he needs to address his medical condition, which became, very sort of under the table, hush hush. And even I had to kind of navigate as a volunteer / researcher how to navigate that, ethically and also without telling the organization director, like, hey, this is what's going on. Like there's different levels of trust and rapport that I had to be aware of. And every decision that I made was in relation to the men that I was working with, to think about, well, what is the best outcome for them, is what I have to prioritize during this research. So I don't know if that answers. Did you have any other questions that I missed, Danielle? Or?
No, everything was covered. Thank you so much. And I want to congratulate you again on your research. I think that it's very powerful what you're doing with this organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. We have a comment from Benelli in the chat. I will just read it. I like the way you presented the data while maintaining confidentiality. My question is, during your volunteering, could you detect what were the health needs of the women in the shelter, even when you weren't directly with them?
That's a really great question. Thank you for this question. So yes, as I mentioned in the presentation, my interactions were, as you acknowledged in the question, right, were a little bit limited. For the women at Justicia y Paz, it is a little bit difficult to confidently say exactly what their experiences were. Much of what I'm about to say comes through interactions with volunteers who worked with the migrant women. And so according to volunteers that worked with migrant women a little bit more closely, and so this is other women volunteers, many of the cases and challenges that migrant women had to engage with had to do with coming from abusive families, and trying to sort of escape from that type of situation. It became pretty commonly known among other volunteers and other migrants through word of mouth that Justicia y Paz was a safe space for women trying to escape domestic violence. But in addition to this, it was also about being in a space that could help migrant women, much like migrant men, navigate asylum cases or refugee cases, to have a temporary place to stay while they find work or find a way, back into the Houston region in some form or fashion. I don't feel comfortable saying more beyond this because it is difficult to extrapolate more than that. But I do think that what comes out of this research is the need for more systematic research about migrant women's experiences in contexts like this. I think it's very important to acknowledge and to understand, especially in relation to prenatal care as well. This is another area that some of the women came to the organization pregnant and were worried about engaging the healthcare system, because of their pregnancy. And here I would defer to the work of other scholars like Lisa Sunhee Park, who've written extensively about interactions with the healthcare system while pregnant, so to speak. But really great question. Again, really highlights an important area needed further research in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And Olga Odgers also would like to make an intervention.
Sure. Gracias, Olga. Thank you very much, Anthony. I think it was fascinating to hear how you are understanding and analyzing the different cases that you may find. And I think it's fascinating to see how you show that it's not enough to distinguish between documented and undocumented, but among those undocumented, what's happening with those that are legible or not. So my question is related to, let me say, I imagine that there's not like a sharp difference between being legible and unlegible. I suppose there is like a gray zone where people can be legible in some cases, but not so in others. And also, I suppose that one single person may flip from one side to another depending on the circumstances. And specifically, I would like to know if you think that medical conditions may put an individual person in one side on the other. So my question is regarding how people move among those groups that you are identifying, and which may be the circumstances that may somebody in particular flip from one side to the other. I'm thinking about this question because, well, many years ago, when we were making some interviews in Los Angeles with undocumented migrants, I remember this lady that was saying something very interesting when we were talking about el derecho a la salud, the right of healthcare. And she said, tenemos derecho a la salud, pero no tenemos derecho a enfermarnos. So she said something like, we have the right to health, but we don't have the right to get sick. And so it was really clear what she was trying to say, in the sense that in the particular circumstances we are living here, as far as we keep healthy, everything will go fine. And we will have a job, and our kids will have school, and everything will be fine. But we cannot afford being sick. So she was explaining us all those things that will happen if she ever gets sick. So that's why I'm thinking that perhaps it's important to think why those specific individuals are in one side of the other of your categories, and what makes somebody flip from one side to the other. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these questions, Olga. These are very important questions. And I think that this idea of legibility and illegibility, I think, is something that much of the immigrant healthcare literature has kind of hinted at and touched on, especially when we think about the literature on chilling effects, for example, where the idea is that particularly migrants, whether documented or not, avoid using the healthcare system because of being seen as needy, right? This interacts with this law of public charge in the U.S. context, or being seen as drawing from a resource that they that some believe or they are not entitled to, or also being visible to the state in the way that, well, is someone going to come grab me and deport me? And you know, if they are undocumented, this becomes another consideration. And so I think that there is an intricate balance here and consideration that I think that you're highlighting is important, right? Where for many of the men that I spoke with and that I worked with during my research, they've been pushed to a point of desperation, medically speaking, where the risks of legibility, the risk of being on the state's radar, was worth the possibility of care to address their condition, whatever the case may be. And for example, I think of, as I detail in the article that I shared, the example of one man who had a hernia, who was in a lot of pain. He couldn't do anything. If he tried lifting things, his intestines could explode at any moment. And he was, I forget his exact age, but he wasn't, you know, he wanted to get out and get working and get back into his day-to-day regime. But because of this hernia, because of the intensity of this medical condition, he decided that being legible, you know, would be way more worthwhile than being illegible and not being able to access care at all. And I think this, you know, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify either, because I do think that there is an important sort of gray area as well that you're highlighting here, Olga, that maybe further research would need to look into, about these considerations as when do I become legible and when do I become illegible. In the context of my research, I was working with individuals who couldn't really make that choice. They were either already legible, they had some form of documentation and were medically, you know, needed to use it, or they were already illegible and unable to access the healthcare system from the get-go. And so I think, yeah, I think further work would be interesting to understand what are the considerations that go into that choice when it does exist, in fact. And I think that, you know, I really appreciate you sharing with me, you know, these other thoughts of this other individual that you shared, about being able to be healthy but not being able to be sick. I think is really powerful, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because in the U.S. context, getting sick is a stigma, right? Whether it is something that continues to be stigmatized, fundamentally because it is attached to this capitalist regime of productivity. I think that as long as someone is sick, I mean, alluding to how you worded it, Olga, if someone is sick, they're unable to work, and if they're unable to work, their value on a societal level is seen as less than it was before. And what I think undocumented migrants contend with on top of this is the idea of, were they, you know, these different levels of deservingness because of their legal status from the get-go. There's different levels, intersectional levels of stigmatization happening here. And so it becomes very depressing to think about this, because the system is set up so much to value health, right? And something that I've shared with students and you know, in other talks related to this research is the notion that is often given to people, is the idea that if you have your health, you have everything. But at the same time, the way that the system is structured, it punishes folks, it punishes people for not having everything, that you shouldn't have to have everything to have your health. And in too many ways, the healthcare system is set up that way within the US context. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And we do have a question from the people that is following the transmission in Facebook. So I will read the question. Is the externalization of migrant healthcare by the state in the case of the US formal and legislated? If so, how? And this is a question from Kari Deshak.
Really great question. Thank you. In a lot of ways, the externalization of long-term care is both formal and formal. And what I mean by that is, in a formal sense, the way that the healthcare system is structured it has a legal foundation to it. Legally speaking, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, I believe of 1986, is the only law that federally requires hospitals to see anyone, regardless of legal status or economic situation, on an emergency case basis. But that is the extent of legally required care. So legally speaking, on a formal level, when migrants are denied care for not having an ID, that's legal. The hospital is in its right to legally enforce that level of exclusion, which then leads to a cascade of consequences. That's so for folks who have to wait for their conditions to worsen, they end up in informal personal care homes because all of a sudden what was a manageable condition becomes a long-term condition and something that they still have no legal access to the healthcare system. So in a lot of ways, the healthcare system is legally set up to push people into and externalize people into less and less formal settings. And that's where the informality comes in, where Justicia y Paz, if it didn't exist, many of the people that need these services would not have them, quite frankly. And in the U.S. context, it is very, very clear, not only for migrants, for citizens as well, to a large degree, that the healthcare system is intentionally set up to really only cater to those who have the money, to cater to those who are employed in certain sectors that they have rewarded in multiple accumulative ways. And for those who are not intersectionally situated as such, they're punished accordingly. And so the healthcare system is set up in a way where they know that they have spaces like Justicia y Paz to turn to. In fact, the director of Justicia y Paz has shared that the hospital system in Houston, Texas, which is one of the largest medical districts in the country, they're calling Justicia y Paz to assist them, right? Not the other way around. They're calling Justicia y Paz to say, we have someone who needs long-term care, for XYZ reasons. Can you help? Right? Because we can't do anything, is what they're saying. It's illegal for hospital systems to do patient dumping. They can't just dump them anywhere. But it is legal and their responsibility to situate them with a space that can pick up that care. And so once they are directed to spaces like Justicia y Paz, then it becomes an informal process where Justicia y Paz can only do so much for so many people that eventually they have to further externalize long-term care to these informal care homes, right? They can't possibly, the volunteers can't possibly care for 100+ individuals in need of long-term care, so they call on the community. And so we can see how, because of the way that the system is structured, undocumented immigrants in particular, those especially with illegible illegality, are legally pushed down further and further echelons of care, where the further down they go, the less and less formal care becomes, the less and less there are formal protections for abuse or social disconnection or the experiences that are highlighted in my research. There are less and less protections for those type of experiences. So in a long-winded answer to your question, which again is a really important question, we see sort of the mixture of the two, where all of this is a legal process, and that's what I detail in my article. And the experiences become more and more informal, which that's where we begin to sort of empirically understand how people experience these structures and why they got to these spaces in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another couple of questions from Facebook as well. And one of those questions made by Rosario Rizolara, saying, great presentation and work. I wanted to ask you, what's the role of the civil society and organizations in helping undocumented migrants?
Thank you, Rosario, for this question. I think kind of alluding to what I mentioned here, I think civil society organizations like Justicia are becoming more and more the go-to for immigrant healthcare. I think a lot of the direction of the U.S. healthcare system indicates that if things don't change, civil society organizations are going to be the next iteration of a formal/informal system. And this is something that's been, I think, in trajectory for a really long time, especially in the U.S. context, especially where even as the U.S. healthcare system has developed over time, it has always relied on informal civil society organizations or sectors to pick up the work that the formal system doesn't do. And as the system becomes more and more privatized, more and more people are shut out from it. And I think that we can kind of see this continue down this path with COVID-19, where in the US context, so many people, home care has become the go-to space for any type of healthcare condition, whether it's something that's very acute or something pretty serious or that maybe becomes chronic. In a lot of ways, the healthcare system in the US context has the technological advancement to handle so many things, but it externalizes much of its care to private homes, to families, to neighbors, to other types of practices like GoFundMes, where people have to raise money on their own to pay for services that they could never afford otherwise. And so, yeah, I think the shorter version of this answer is to say that civil society plays an enormous role in immigrant healthcare, and I think that as time goes on, it will continue to play an even larger and larger role throughout time.
Thanks. And our last question from Facebook is one question from Kari Deshek as well. Did you explore any theory around emergency extreme coping strategies to frame the healthcare seeking strategies you mentioned? Did you characterize or categorize these strategies?
Yeah, I misunderstood the question. Could you repeat that, Olga? I'm sorry.
Yes, of course. It says, did you explore any theory around emergency extreme coping strategies to frame the healthcare seeking strategies you mentioned? And then they want to know if you characterize or categorize the strategies people use, the kind of strategies to get access to the services or to seeking the services. I don't know if this was clear for you.
I think so. I could try answering this, and of course, if more clarification is needed, I can try to answer further. I mean, so I didn't look at any particular theories around emergency or emergency care per se. I think that, I mean, I did observe some instances where some of the men would try to would pretend to have an emergency in order to access care. One of the men, he needed a certain medication to help regulate. He would have anxiety attacks essentially, and when he ran out of medicine and the doctor refused to give him more, he said he didn't go through with this, but what he said he wanted to do is go into the hospital and pretend to have an anxiety attack, so that way they could see, oh, he needs this medicine. So there was a sort of a performative component there that he considered. This is the same individual, though, who had a family member bring in the medicine from Mexico, sort of under the table. But in terms of coping mechanisms and sort of handling these situations holistically, I do think that the men that I spoke with, that I participated with, they really provided that community to one another. Similar to what I was saying at the beginning of our discussion, where this community in Justicia y Paz became their family for many of them, and they would not only support each other in terms of their physical and mental health needs, but they would also encourage one another to try to help build these networks and get their foot in the door for certain types of informal labor, or help connect them to other people in the Houston region, which I believe other, of course, immigration scholars have written about extensively, the power of these networks and being able to sort of get a foot in the door within larger segments of society. But that's kind of the extent of my understanding of what went on. But if there's anything that I can clarify, about your question, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you so much. I do have also a couple of comments that I would like to elaborate, since we
Sure.
don't have any other comment from the people following us. And one of the comments, well, I really appreciate your presentation. And as I said before, I was thinking a lot on the research project that we're currently conducting in Tijuana. And I was thinking, because one of our interests is to look at the trajectory, the health trajectory of the people that are now stranded in the border region. And I was thinking through your presentation, if you were able to explore that trajectory, because what the cases you're presenting us in some way are critical conditions and that are harder to treat, and all the failures they find in the system, the healthcare system. And I would like to know if you were able to explore the health trajectory of these persons, if they were dealing with certain health conditions already in their places of origin, if they became more, if these conditions worsened during the transit, or if was a result of living in undocumented condition in the US for a long period of time. So if you can provide any information in regards to that, I will appreciate that. And the second comment is in regards public policies. I know that it's very hard to turn research into an input for public policy development, but I would like to know if you have any thought in regards to that, like writing a policy brief regarding this and your findings. And also, I would like to know if, I know this is not a part of the study, but if you look at other contexts in the US, would you find that it is easier for some undocumented migrants to get access, or is the same case in the whole country? Or is there something particular in Houston that makes harder for them? Like, for example, in some other places, there was a period when they were able to get driver licenses, even if they were undocumented, or any reform that could be implemented that have worked in other contexts in the US that could be implemented in this context that you're studying. And if not, which are like the things that make harder to pursue those reforms for undocumented migrants?
Thank you so much for these questions, Olga. And similar to Daniela, I tried to write down as much as I could, but please let me know if I forget something here. So I think your first question has to do with the health trajectory. So in speaking with the men at Justicia y Paz, I could kind of get some sense of this although sort of limited, you know, in terms of what people would share, and you know, these experiences varied quite widely. I think that many of the folks that I spoke with experienced various forms of violence on their way to Justicia y Paz, right? I think whether it was while crossing the border, which was not everyone at Justicia y Paz, there were others who had come in on a visa and overstayed the visa and you know, made their way to Justicia y Paz at some point. But particularly for those who did cross the U.S. to Mexico border, there were not only physical harms, but also mental harms that were experienced in terms of witnessing types of abuse and detriment. And some of them did have some physical conditions where, for example, one man who showed up to Justicia y Paz had a bullet hole in his leg, and it was something that has tried to treat over time, but it was, you know, en route to the United States, and eventually he made his way to Justicia y Paz. And so it's hard to say definitively, you know, what everyone experiences en route to the organization, but everyone that comes to the organization does have a story about violence, some form of violence that they've experienced, whether it is a physical or mental violence at the physical border, or just other types of violence about being sort of left out of different types of institutions in the United States. And I think what's important I think what I try to sort of emphasize in my work is that this is really about experiencing the border constantly, that people begin to experience the violence, the structural and symbolic violence of the border long before crossing the border, whether that's done literally or, you know, in a sort of metaphorical sense. And coming to Justicia y Paz and other sectors of society is navigating a society with the border mapped onto their bodies always and already. And so how to sort of navigate that and the violence attached to that. And so I think understanding this, I think, really makes it difficult to promote or suggest any very clear public policies. I always struggle personally to promote particular policies because maybe my own personal skepticism about the legal protections and just based in the histories of the abuses that have happened despite legal protections, where we think about numbers of populations who have been subject to state violence despite being citizens or despite legal protections that are supposed to be in place. And so I think with this in mind, I think two things come to mind here. I think first, as I mentioned in my paper, I think that the ID requirements are a good start, acknowledging that they are very, very limited. But I think being able to offer IDs to migrants is a really powerful start, one that I think is maybe underestimated in a lot of contexts. Because that legibility is so key, not just in the healthcare context, but certainly other areas of society as well, where we think about the work of for example, Juana Maya Castro, who writes about illegality regimes, the fact that these types of checkpoints happen not just in healthcare settings, but every institution we come face to face with, whether it's housing or school or, so on and so forth. So I think the ID, promoting the idea of having everybody be able to gain some form of identification is really important. But I think more importantly is it's hard to promote a public policy around this, but I think representations of migrants is in need of very, very dire work, right? Not just in a political level, but in terms of media, the way in which we talk about race relations in the US context and understanding that the violence experienced by the state in the US context is fundamentally attached to how people are racialized or not racialized. And so if people, you know, if people are racialized as quote unquote other or quote unquote non-white, right, then they are subject to various forms of violence. And we see this already with COVID and the way that the Trump administration had racialized Asian and Asian American populations. There's certain forms of violence being promoted there, where anyone who looks Asian is subject to the policing of citizens, right? We see that this sort of informal border control falls into the hands of private citizens, and with impunity too. That is what's most damning and horrific about this. And so again, this is all to say that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the sort of racial politics of migrants and understanding race relations in the U.S. on a broader level, which is currently sort of, I would say, under attack, where things like critical race theory are being heavily stigmatized. These systems, right? And I think that there's an intense polarization to contend with, especially after the Trump administration and everything that it did during its 4 years in operation. And in terms of your last question, in terms of other contexts where we can see different dynamics occurring, I absolutely agree that the dynamics that I observed in Houston, Texas, could be very different in other contexts, and I think it's necessary to explore how. For example, I can think of the work of Tiffany Joseph, who has done research, I believe, in the Boston context, and has shown that at a local level, the healthcare system is very active in trying to allow and enable healthcare access to undocumented immigrants in particular. I think that the political context really matters a lot. In Houston, it is known as a sanctuary city, at least the last time that I checked, and I think that because of its richness and people from everywhere, there is more of a promotion and a supportive environment to welcome migrants and to do what they can to support day-to-day lives, which can look very different, I think, to your point, Olga, in spaces like Arizona, where, as I mentioned, that my colleague does work there, knows that the political atmosphere really matters, that citizens there are less forgiving, or not forgiving is the right word, but are more brutal in terms of how much they support or don't support immigrant rights movements. And so I think absolutely local context matters, and it is definitely a call for further research, I think, to understand, especially about this question of legibility and illegibility. How does this factor in to different local contexts across the United States? Still remains to be an important question to explore further.
Thank you so much for elaborating on all these questions that we have made, and I think you did a wonderful presentation, and we were able to reflect all together in topics that we are interested in, and for the common topics that we are researching as well. And I appreciate that from you to have this conversation. So if anyone else from those colleagues that are here through Blue Jeans want to add something, if not, I think we can start concluding our session today. No? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for being here in our seminar, and we will be sure to share. This presentation is available online, So in case anyone would like to see the presentation later, and we have shared your article and there's your contact information as well in case someone is interested in following your work and your future research that will be exploring more the COVID-19 pandemic impact on these migrants as well, which I think will be so relevant as well. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos los que nos acompañaron en esta sesión, a los que nos siguieron a través de redes sociales, YouTube, y también a quienes se unieron a este seminario a través de Blue Jeans. Agradecemos a todos sus comentarios, su presencia, y en especial al doctor Jimenez por su presentación y por la discusión que abrió en este seminario. Y bueno, solamente estaremos informándoles en el futuro sobre alguna sesión que organicemos en los meses próximos. Muchas gracias y bueno, con esto concluimos nuestra sesión del seminario.
Thank you very much. Very appreciative. Very happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.